Good evening, friends, and welcome to the 2014 Bechtel Lectures. We're very glad to have you here. I'm Jim Pancratz, Dean of the College. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of President Susan Schultz-Hutzman and my faculty colleagues. Welcome here. We're in for a good evening tonight and tomorrow night. These Bechtel Lectures are a very, very important part of the life of this college and this community. Every year, these lectures explore distinctive and sometimes common characteristics of the global Anabaptist community, the various contributions that Mennonites have made, various individuals have made to this particular tradition. Many of you have attended many of these public lectures, and you know they've been a real rich feast over the years. And there was more light. We've been working at that for quite a while. I'd like to believe it was something I said, but it wasn't. It's not so simple. Tonight we're going to continue this tradition of very interesting subjects and really excellent speakers. Now you know, if you've seen the program as you came in, that you're doubly blessed this year because we have two outstanding speakers who are with us. They'll be lecturing one each evening, but one of the treats will be at the end of each lecture. The other one will respond briefly to that first person's lecture. So tonight, Steve Nolt will be speaking, Royman will respond briefly, and then it will be reversed tomorrow night. And then you'll, of course, be able to engage in your own questions after the lecture. So, Lester Bechtel, thank you very much for your sponsorship of these lectures. These have been very, very good years. And we're grateful for the interest you took in the college, but also in this subject. You mentioned to me several times in conversation that you wanted to do something for the community. Well, indeed you have. So thank you. Join me in thanking you. In recent years, we've had quite a variety, haven't we? For those of you who've been here and others who haven't, I'll remind you. Last year, Chris Marshall from New Zealand was here talking about the Bible and restorative justice. Before that, John Roth was here to speak about the global Anabaptist Church. A year before that, Roger Epp addressed our complex Canadian history, the relationship between First Nations and settlers, and he had that intriguing title, "We Are All Treaty People." These lectures have audiences also beyond this room. Tonight we're taping this lecture. We'll be posting it on our website. And so for those of you who are watching it in another place and another time, we welcome you as well. Please feel free to go to our website in the days after these lectures and listen to them again. Enjoy them again. Tell friends about them who might not have been able to attend today. And many of you also know that the lectures appear in our Conrad Grebel Review, which is the college's academic journal. So that gives them another life beyond this particular audience. And we're grateful to share that with an audience, not only of those who read the journal in print, but those who read it through our website and through several academic portals, so people all over the world can read and can experience these wonderful lectures. With this year, you know we have two lectures. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to introduce the lecture for tonight, and then simply to say to you that we will have a question and answer period after. We will have a reception tomorrow night, not tonight, so tomorrow night we'll have a reception after the lecture. There will also be books for sale, and you'll be able to get the authors to sign books and buy some additional books, and enjoy part of our new space. In the second chapter campaign, some of the new building has come open, and you'll be able to enjoy that in the reception in the atrium. So do come back tomorrow for the lectures and the chance to visit with friends. So now I'll ask my colleague, Troy Osborne, to introduce the speaker for this evening.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Nolt as the first of this year's two Bechtel lecturers. Originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Steve has been at Goshen College in Indiana since 1999, where he teaches in the areas of immigration and ethnic history, Mennonite and Amish life and thought, and general United States history. Steve is a graduate of Goshen College and has earned a master's degree in theological studies from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, and earned his master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Now, Steve is a historian with an eye on the local history of religious groups and what changes in those religious groups can tell us about larger social cultural patterns. He's the author of a dozen books, and I'd just like to highlight a few for you this evening. Most recently, with Royden Lowen in 2012, he co-authored Seeking Places of Peace, which is the fifth volume in the North American volume in the Global Mennonite History Series. And in 2013, Steve, with Donald Grebel and Karen Johnson Weiner, wrote The Amish with Johns Hopkins University Press. And Steve also worked as academic advisor on the excellent documentary on the Amish that was recently produced by the Public Broadcasting Corporation in the United States. I recommend it to everybody. It's worth finding. Along with Donald Grebel and David Weaver-Zerker, Steve wrote Amish Grace, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy, on the Amish response to the 2006 Nickel Mines school shooting. Again, another excellent volume. Now, as Jim said, if you want to read more and purchase these books, they will be for sale tomorrow at the reception. Steve's current writing projects, which I hope you will discuss a bit tonight, include the book Anabaptists in America, which will be part of the Columbia University Press's Columbia Contemporary American Religion series, as well as a history of the church in which he was raised, Mellinger Mennonite Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which he says will be observing its 300th anniversary in 2017. Steve is married to Rachel Miller Nolt, who is pastor at Silverwood Mennonite Church in Goshen, and they are the parents of two daughters, Lydia and Esther. Steve, welcome to congregation.
All right. Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you this evening for this series of lectures, and thank you to Mr. Bechtel and to the administrators and all of you here from the Grebel community. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. I understand that on this 50th anniversary of Conrad Grebel University College, one of the themes has been storytelling and thinking about stories, and we are narrative creatures, and we tell stories. We tell stories even when we don't realize we're telling stories. The stories, so to think about, this year you're thinking about stories, and Ray and I have been asked to think with you about stories that we tell each other, stories that we tell ourselves, stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, stories that we tell other people about ourselves, and the relationship between those stories, the relationship between the communal story and the individual story, between the confessional story and the ecumenical story, between the national and the transnational. As someone who both studies Amish society and has good Amish friends, and sometimes feels strange to admit that you study your friends or to even phrase it that way, but Amish folks are great storytellers, and I'd like to reflect this evening on story, on narratives, on the way our audiences and the way in which identities and representations work by using the Amish. Three different windows, I'll call them. The first window is to look through the ways in which broader North American, and mostly U.S. media and tourism, but ways in which broader North American society has told stories about the Amish, tried to understand the Amish. Second, to think about how the Amish understand themselves in very recent years through a set of experiences that they've developed by going to Mexico and working in Old Colony Mennonite schools. This is a rather recent phenomenon, and so how do Amish people understand themselves as North Americans by going to Mexico? And then third, I hope to conclude by offering a window into a more personal window, my own reflections on how I as a scholar, as a Mennonite, represent or think about the Amish. So the first window, North American narratives about the Amish. In 1900, the North American Amish population was small, probably no more than 6,000 people, and attracted scant public attention. Observers at the time would have been hard-pressed to imagine the Amish developing a coast-to-coast reputation, let alone becoming cultural or media icons. Yet during the course of the 20th century, that's exactly what happened. Without an organized public relations campaign, promotional budget, or celebrity spokesperson, a tiny and publicly self-effacing religious group became widely known. By the 1990s, comedians and cartoonists and television scriptwriters could include offhand references to the Amish with the assurance that audiences, even if misinformed about the details of Amish culture, would recognize the name the Amish. Of course, that most North Americans had come to regard the Amish in certain ways says more about mainstream society than it does about the Amish themselves. But nonetheless, these stories about the Amish had an impact on ordinary Amish life, because the way in which other people understood the Amish shaped public policy that had an impact on Amish life, shaped tourism that had an impact on Amish life. And so Amish identity in the 20th century was hewn not only from their own convictions, but also by the stories that others told about them. The beginning of the book, The Amish, that was mentioned in the introduction, and co-authors and I recount the story of Gertrude Enders Huntington, a young Quaker woman who in the 1950s was beginning doctoral studies in anthropology at Yale University, and her advisor told her to get out to Ohio and interview those Amish people before they disappear. They're not going to be around much longer. The last ones will certainly die out within a generation. And yet today there are 285,000 horse and buggy driving Amish people in North America. The population doubles about every 18 years. And retention rates of youth, which had been about 60% in the mid-20th century, are now about 85%. The Amish themselves have a bit of a joke about this. They say, what will happen when half the world's population becomes Amish? and the answer is, the other half will be drivers for the Amish. The Amish first gained attention in the 1930s as they became entangled in efforts to resist government involvement in local life. In 1937, a group of Amish parents in one Pennsylvania township organized opposition to the consolidation of rural schools and tried to halt the construction of a new school building. Now, since most communities at that time were fighting for a share of New Deal dollars, Amish opposition to federal funds was newsworthy, and the Amish cause made the New York Times and a series of articles in 1937 and 1938. And the image in those stories was of ill-informed people fighting a futile battle against the future. One of those New York Times articles used in the headline characteristic of the Amish life as drab. Conflicts heated up in the United States and to a lesser degree here in Ontario as expanded programs that cared for the aged or dictated workplace dress and other issues became more common. After 1955, some self-employed Amish farmers suddenly refused to participate in public welfare programs in the United States, and they garnered sympathy from critics of big government, including the editors of Reader's Digest magazine. And they did eventually receive exemption from those programs in the United States in 1965, in Ontario a few years later. And as minority group rights and identity politics and multiculturalism gained ground in the 1960s and 1970s, the Amish won additional group-based exemptions. In this context, conflicts over compulsory high school attendance found resolution in the states in a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1972, in which Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote in defense of Amish descent that they had the religious right to not be modern. This anti-modern imagery was closely tied, though, to the older logic of a drab life, because the justice's argument also assumed that that the Amish were backward farmers, and thus they don't really need much advanced schooling. By the end of the 20th century, however, conflicts with the state often conjured public appraisals of the Amish that were much less sympathetic. Could ultra-conservative Amish folks refuse to immunize their children? Could they persist in using primitive plumbing that undercut public health codes? Local jurisdictions often said no, even when national civil rights lawyers said yes. And when cases of Amish child abuse surfaced, the public was decidedly unsympathetic to the Amish argument that their self-trained counselors and homespun treatment centers were better suited to deal with perpetrators and handle victims' needs than were professional social service workers, whom the Amish often held at bay. Another set of popular images of the Amish revolved around Amish aversions to the latest forms of technology. As rural electrification and telephone cooperatives and agricultural mechanization became common in the early 20th century, the Amish refused to connect to public utilities or to buy cars, and this began to set them apart from their rural neighbors in ways that had not been common in the late 19th century. After World War II, most Amish refused tractor farming, even when ag extension agents encouraged them to pull out of the mud, quoting one brochure. Farming with horses kept agriculture small scale, and although some adopted hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers, their farming methods remained labor intensive. More visibly, horse and buggy travel marked the Amish as distinctively odd in nations committed to automobile ownership and conducting multi-million-dollar provincial and interstate highway systems. Suddenly then, in the 1970s, the image of the Amish as irrelevant relics was flipped upside down. The energy crisis and an emerging environmental consciousness created an atmosphere in which the Amish were now hailed as people who were not behind the time, but ahead of the time. Activists certain that small is beautiful applauded the Amish as people who lived off the grid. Indeed, many outsiders began to see the Amish as Luddites who opposed all technology, which of course had never been the case. As such images gained currency in the ensuing decades, observers were shocked and often indignant to learn that Amish youth, for example, used inline skates, or that some Amish contractors used cell phones on the job site. I had received one call a number of years ago from someone who wanted to know where they could report an Amish contractor who they saw driving a forklift, and who was the relevant authority who could be informed of this, of this offense. Inadvertently, popular understandings of the Amish as technophobes created a mystique around Amish-produced products, in effect an Amish brand for consumers looking for distinctive goods that bespoke a plain, homespun aesthetic. The appeal of the Amish brand, almost exclusively promoted by non-Amish entrepreneurs, fueled Amish small business growth and a boom in Amish-built furniture and other woodcrafts that ironically demanded homemade products that encouraged Amish entrepreneurs to adopt new technologies in an effort to boost production to match consumer appetites. The consumption of Amish products, with their enticing Amish brand, was intertwined with Amish-themed tourism. In the mid-1950s, middle-class tourism was mushrooming. Bus and car tours promised views of an old-fashioned way of life for, at first, East Coast urbanites living in a post-war society undergoing dramatic change, and in some cases, this would have been aging pre-1920 Eastern European immigrants who saw in the Amish part of their peasant past still alive in the Western Hemisphere. The 1955 Broadway musical Plain and Fancy, which mixed Amish family life with a celebration of Western self-determination, dramatically boosted tourism. The first Amish-focused attractions that charged admission also opened that same year in 1955, and each of these venues mixed images of the Amish as quaint relics with hints that these people might well be the keepers of traditional wisdom in this new atomic age of science and suburbia. A combination of nostalgia and avant-garde art merged in 1971 with an interest in Amish quilts. In 1971, the Whitney Museum of American Modern Art in New York City included an Amish quilt in an exhibition entitled Abstract Design in American Fabric. It treated functional handicrafts as boldly designed modern art. Collectors began flocking to Amish settlements to buy old quilts, which one scholar dubbed America's first abstract art. And there's a new book I would highly recommend by Yannick and Smucker that describes this 1970s phenomenon. The sudden rush to acquire their quilts birthed a new cottage industry among Amish women and reshaped their quilting traditions as they adapted to the demands of contemporary design. As one woman told me in the early 90s, we have to keep up with what colors are fashionable nowadays so we can make changes from one year to the next. Within a few years, Doug Tompkins, founder of the Esprit Clothing Company, had filled his San Francisco headquarters with Amish quilts that he said were both old-fashioned and cutting-edge. Amish tourism received a further boost in 1985 thanks to the Academy Award-winning feature film Witness, starring Harrison Ford. The film's unlikely plot, I think unlikely anyway, revolved around the clash of cultures that flared when a hardened detective found refuge on an Amish farm. Witness presented the Amish people as peaceful but naive. In the end, they are saved by Harrison Ford's use of a gun and by killing someone. Sequestered from the world and unfamiliar with modern ways, this combination of images spurred on Amish-themed tourism in many places. The same image of naivete has propelled the sales of millions of Amish-themed romance novels, celebrating chaste characters in chaste communities with chaste plots. That triple chastity author Valerie Weaver-Zurcher has highlighted in another book I would recommend called The Thrill of the Chaste. And she does a very interesting analysis of modern culture and the appeal of these books. Popular media has been complicit in shaping public perceptions of Amish identity, but two events around the turn of the 21st century highlighted how the Amish had become media icons in different ways. In 1998 and again in 2006, high-profile crime stories wove together images of pastoral innocence and hard-edged drama. In 1998, two Amish-reared young men linked to a pagan motorcycle gang cocaine distribution ring were caught selling drugs to their Amish friends in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This remarkable collage of images made the Amish drug bust story a sensation. But it also revealed that some unbaptized Amish teens lived very differently from their parents, which generated intense media interest. And overnight, the Pennsylvania Dutch word Roomspringen became a term that was integrated into all sorts of stories around the world. Soon after, an independent film entitled The Devil's Playground tracked drug use among a few Amish teens in northern Indiana. Other media stories focused on alleged animal abuse at Amish hands. Reality TV shows such as Breaking Amish followed. The theme in this string of exposés was one of hypocrisy. The Amish, turned out, had been too good to be true. In fact, they were not very good at all. Then in 2006, another crime story propelled public perceptions of the Amish in a different direction. On October 2nd of that year, a non-Amish man entered an Amish school near Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, took the girls in the school hostage, shot all 10 of them, 5 of them fatally, before killing himself. News media swarmed to the Crossroads village to cover this horrific event in the most idyllic of locations. But within hours, the story of lost innocence had shifted to one of bewilderment as reporters struggled to understand how members of the Amish community seemed almost immediately to forgive the shooter and reach out in compassion to members of his family, hugging them at his burial and treating them as fellow victims. This incident thrust images of the Amish as unbelievably forgiving people into hundreds of stories. Many writers saw the Amish as living Christian values that lots of people profess but few practice. Others thought the Amish were being emotionally unhealthy. For their part, the Amish were as uncomfortable with this news story as they had been with the drug bust story, although for different reasons. And this is a sentence that appeared in one of the Amish correspondence newspapers, Botschaft. The news reports have set a high standard for us. We don't want to be exalted. Now we're under the public eye. We wonder, can we Amish people really be what the public expects of us now? What does the public expect of us now? That's not the quote, that's not back to me. What does the public expect of us now? The fluctuating answers over the last 50 or 60 years, as religion and media scholar David Weaver-Zurcher has argued, seems to oscillate between two poles. We view the Amish as both a saving remnant, a simple, pious community, living life as it once was and still could be, yet we also need to see the Amish as a fallen people, the subject of exposés and the butt of jokes that reveal the real and repressed nature of their life. Perhaps these seemingly conflicting interpretations always go together, because it reassures us modern observers that we need not feel guilty if we admire, but then quietly dismiss the Amish way. Otherwise, the Amish witness might demand some actual response on our part. Second window, Amish images of themselves as North Americans. Begin with a quote. When visiting the Mennonites in Mexico, our neighbors to the south, we see a culture similar to ours in some ways, yet very different from ours. Not only have they adapted to a climate and terrain quite different from us, but they also interact with the Spanish and Indian cultures around them. This is an excerpt from a letter from one of more than 100 Amish women and a few men who since the year 2000 have spent between several months and several years living in Mexico, teaching in Old Colony Mennonite schools and a few Kleine Gemeinde Mennonite schools. This Old Colony Mennonite Support Network, as it's called, is a recent example of Amish engagement with the world beyond their own settlements, and bears, I think, some novel marks of, not exactly mission work and not exactly international development work, but something different for the Amish. And it has clearly expresses the constraints of Amish history and cultural values, but it has also held up for the Amish a kind of mirror to themselves that they haven't had in quite this way before, I don't think. And this is not the place for a complete history of the Amish Teachers to Mexico project, but suffice it to say that in 1995, Mennonite Central Committee staff in Pennsylvania wanted to facilitate a learning tour for constituents, and were interested in including some Amish people, and they said, well, we can do a learning tour as long as we don't have to fly anywhere. And so the MCC staff person said, well, we could take a bus trip to Mexico and look at what MCC is doing in Mexico. And the group visited Old Colony and Kleine Gemeinde communities where some MCC staff were working. And what happened is the interactions there took on a life of their own as Amish constituents from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana sensed a sort of plain group kinship with these people who they really didn't know anything about. And conversations and contacts continued then wholly apart from the MCC channels. Wrote Amish woman Priscilla Stolzfus, the Old Colony Mennonite way of thinking seemed to be more like the Amish than I would have expected from a group called Mennonites. For her, the term Mennonite conjured, quote, the more liberal side, unquote, of the people that she knew. But working in Mexico alongside these Mennonites, quote, are entirely as strict as the Amish, unquote, which she took as a good thing. The next year, Old Colony Mennonite leaders did their own bus trip from India to Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The purpose of this was to introduce some cottage industries as an alternative to their crop failure, one Amish person has written. They now saw the need to improve their schools and farming practices. They also visited Amish schools in these places. They also had a lot of questions concerning church matters. The first result of these interactions in the late 1990s was an Amish interest in raising money to allow Old Colony Mennonites to buy more land, to improve dairy herds, to engage in well drilling, to construct a cheese plant in one case. And all of these projects moved forward to some degree. But by the late 1990s, the focus of the relationship was converging on schools, on Amish support for reforming Old Colony Mennonite curricula and pedagogy. Reforming schools became the heart of the relationship because it connected deeply with both groups. On the Old Colony side, of course, as many of you know, parochial schooling was one of the reasons they had come to Canada, and then the reason they had left Canada. And it was an area of life most closely regulated by tradition, and it served as a marker, much like horse and buggy transportation did for the Amish. Old Colony Mennonites in Mexico had resisted assimilated Mennonite suggestions that they change their system of education, but talking with plain people, the Amish, also committed to separation from the world, who had their own set of schools, seemed less threatening. From the Amish side, parochial schooling by the year 2000 was also a point of humble pride. Amish schools by that time were thriving, 30-some years after the Wisconsin versus Yoder court case. The Amish had been educated in their schools for a couple generations by now, was anything the Amish wanted to talk about, it was their schools. Again, not all Amish and not all Old Colony folks in Mexico, but a remarkable number on both sides. So in 2000, this Amish organized Old Colony Support Committee began sending Amish teachers, and these were almost exclusively young women, women who had experienced teaching in Amish schools in the US, to Mexico to train Old Colony teachers, and then eventually to start some entirely new schools on what they called the Amish model, which meant having graded classes, phonics-based reading, pedagogies other than rote memorization, the use of workbooks, charts, decorating classroom walls with pictures, and so on. In the first few terms, Amish teachers interacted with Old Colony teachers apart from the students, just more teacher-to-teacher interaction. And then in 2002, Amish teachers, in some cases, were able to be in the schools while the schools were in session, and thus able to teach teachers using the new system, as they call it, directly. And in some cases, Amish teachers were running the schools themselves. The support committee publishes a regular newsletter, and some of the teachers have published memoirs and edited diaries and letters, all describing their adventures in what they call Old Mexico. I asked one of the teachers, after she said this a number of times, I said, what do you call Old Mexico? She said, well, isn't New Mexico a state? I said, oh, well, yeah, right, I forgot that. Reading these sources, one finds a complex Amish self-understanding, one that recognizes historical and theological links with Old Colony Mennonites, to be sure, but one that also notices differences and then toggles between a sense of North American superiority and hints of cultural, well, more than hints, but also then turns it into a critique of the Amish themselves, and in some cases hints of almost a kind of cultural relativism, all of which are products of spending time in Mexico and represent new departures of thought for these Amish teachers and for those back home who are avid readers of their letters. So, a few examples of recognizing themselves as North Americans in new ways. Our government and the American culture, even with all its faults, is seen in a different light upon having seen the Mexican conditions. In the United States, honesty is expected in the business world, even among non-Christians. Upfront dealings are the norm instead of merely a possibility. And I now value in a new way our Northern Police Force and ambulance services. Other examples of a sense of North American, Northern superiority. The Amish found Old Colony schools surprisingly deficient, and although they often try to be polite in their reports, some of their assessment is blunt. Old Colony schools, in their view, rely entirely too much on rote memorization and on a high German catechism as just about the only text. Unlike the Amish, whose first language clearly is Pennsylvania Dutch, but whose schooling is almost all in English. Old Colony Mennonites' first language is Low German, but their schooling tries to be in High German, and they rarely use Spanish in schools, the local vernacular. School attendance, from the Amish perspective, is episodic and unenforced. Parents don't take an active interest in schooling, again, from the Amish perspective, and so on. Amish teachers, whose commitment to schooling is only through the 8th grade in North America, and whose parents and grandparents had gone to jail rather than to send them to high school in the 1960s, were suddenly placed in a position of advocating the need for more advanced education and for encouraging more rigorous schooling and building a case for the importance and centrality of formal education. In letters home, these teachers write repeatedly of the value of education, their thanks to past generations of Amish parents for stressing the importance of schooling, for making them go to school, as well as the blessings of public truancy laws that require children to go to school and don't leave such matters to chance. This is, in all, a new narrative of the Amish by the Amish. As well, these teachers give muted but discernible criticism to the place of women in Old Colony society. These Amish women who are writing are far from feminists, but they are surprised that Amish women they are surprised that their Old Colony peers are so limited in their autonomy from the Amish perspective. They note that Old Colony women do not vote in church business meetings, as Amish women have apparently for 300 years. They note that there are few small businesses run by women, whereas in North America there are many Amish businesswomen. In some cases, Amish men quit their jobs to work for their wives because their wives' businesses are so much more lucrative. These young women themselves, as teachers, spend months living abroad and offering leadership, creative ideas, and direction to the still male-centered Old Colony school boards. They write monthly reports to the Old Colony Support Committee back in North America, which is made up of men. And some of these reports are published in the quarterly newsletter. The sense of northern superiority is also conveyed in the subtitle of an Amish published book of teacher experiences. The subtitle is Bringing Hope and Literacy to the Old Colony Mennonites. Often descriptions of Old Colony Mennonite communities serves as a kind of negative warning to northern Amish churches. The so-called low morals of Old Colony Mennonites cause us to come home and look at our own issues in a different light. We realize more fully the danger of allowing or tolerating ungodly conduct among our people, even in small ways, such as in reading books with low morals, in filthy language and smoking, in disrespect for parents in the ministry, and wearing revealing clothing. Said another, I recognize that in all cultures there are strengths and weaknesses, and in order to maintain anything of value, one dare not become lax. However, unlike assimilated Mennonite critiques of Low German Mexican Mennonites, Amish criticism is absolutely wedded to a sense that each of us needs to search our own hearts and see where we stand and where we personally need to clean house in our own Amish heart. In other words, the use of the Mexican Old Colony Mennonites as a foil works for the Amish only because the Amish see themselves as such near kin who face the same challenges and temptations that the Old Colony Mennonite experience is very much like a mirror. Again, unlike the criticism of assimilated Mennonites from the north, the Amish have no interest in or even concept of converting Old Colony people or leading them to any evangelical conversion experience. Amish writers accept the Old Colony worldview and basic theological framework, and so their critiques quickly turn back on themselves. For example, regarding illiteracy, so they'll name illiteracy as they see it, as a problem among Old Colony folks, and then say, quote, there are many things to be learned by experience. However, there are many things to be learned by experience when a person cannot read, we must recognize. Though many of them can't read, they are by no means dull people. We learn that they grasp solid Christian concepts that we think we would never have learned if we could not read. And sometimes even, as I said earlier, maybe even bits of cultural relativism. That's probably not the best phrase, but how else to describe these sorts of statements from Amish teachers? I've learned that my own way of doing things, the way I grew up with, no longer seems like the only way to do it. It's funny how prejudiced we can become, how defensive we can be of our own ideas and opinions and methods. Experiencing a different culture showed me how narrow-minded I was. To use another example, the most important thing is that I learned to understand better about God's unconditional love for us and God's love for one another in other places. Common here is also the observation that life in Mexico has its distinct advantages over life in North America. For example, it's slower paced, and Northern Amish need to slow down and avoid the traps of escalating entrepreneurship and spend more time visiting one another. Quote, in Mexico, they look at time differently than we do. There's always time for interruptions. After all, what is time? A day later works just as well. It would be nice to always have time for one another, wouldn't it? We could use some of that mentality up here. The Old Colony people offer an image of life as it once was in agrarian North America, and the Amish who care about maintaining the old order take note. In some ways, it seems a bit like some of the 1950s writing aimed at a tourist population outside of New York City, reflecting on Amish life at that time. Going to Mexico has also inspired members of the Old Colony Support Network to give more attention to their own Amish history, to stories of migration, and to an appreciation of language. The Amish teachers expressed surprise at how overtly stories of migration and of being strangers and pilgrims in this world shape Old Colony identity, and contrast that, in the most articulated, contrast that with a less historicized separation from the world trope invoked in Amish circles that's not quite as concretely linked to migration. Old Colony support newsletters regularly feature stories about Old Colony history and Russian Mennonite history generally, and end by urging readers to refamiliarize themselves with their own Amish story, and to not become too comfortable or complacent in North America. Quote, "Those who return from Mexico seem without fail to testify to a fresh realization of our priceless heritage." Wrote another person, "Returned from Mexico longing to thank my parents, who alas are no longer living, for what they did in passing on the faith to me." Thus, the Old Colony Support Program has refined, maybe done more than that, but refined Amish identity by bringing the Amish into contact with another Anabaptist group in a different political environment, in a different cultural context. The Amish continue to see themselves as different from assimilated Mennonites. Plainness has been affirmed in this relationship. But they also see themselves in some ways as North American, in ways that they had not accented before. They accented in Amish ways that reaffirm the emphasis on humility and self-critique, but also in ways that highlight their appreciation for their North American context in ways that they had not articulated before. The third window, my use of the Amish. Those who present Amish life and Amish ways to a broader public, of course, always write from a point of view, or multiple points of view, from a particular social location with particular interests in mind. Orland Gingrich's book, The Amish of Canada, in many ways is quite appropriately a book that's really about explaining how and why the Western Ontario Mennonite Conference existed. Over the course of the last 50 years, John A. Hostetler stands out as one of the most important voices in presenting an explanation of the Amish to academics and also to the general public. Hostetler was born to Amish parents in Pennsylvania, but was raised in Iowa, where his father fell under the ban and was excommunicated. And John privately criticized the bishops in a letter, rather directly, taking them on for their treatment of his father. At the same time, he was spending countless hours sympathetically explaining the practice of shunning to thousands of readers outside the Amish world, living both inside and outside that specific experience and the Amish experience generally. Hostetler, whose teaching years were in Alberta and in Pennsylvania, wrote his dissertation on the sociology of Mennonite evangelism, which ended up being a rather sharp critique of that topic, and later worked in an anthropology department where he made sense of Amish life to students as little communities of high context culture that had something to teach modern people. I wonder, looking back, were his explanations of Amish life also a signal to his many still Amish relatives that he had not moved too far up the Anabaptist escalator in joining the Mennonites? Hostetler assumed that Amish and Mennonites shared much in common, and he would repeatedly tick off the Direct Track Confession, adult baptism, non-resistance, non-spraying blows, resistance to holding public office, and on and on. Quote, "The Amish today differ from the Mennonites only in the extent to which external changes have affected the group," he wrote in 1963. At that time, he could also assume that, quote, "most young people who leave the Amish become Mennonites," something which is no longer the case today. Hostetler was a student of Harold Bender, and Hostetler publicly dedicated his work to Bender, who was in many ways the dean of the mid-century recovery of the Neo-Anabaptist vision. And for Hostetler, the charter, as he often called it, of Amish life was the Schleitheim Confession. There was for Hostetler this big tent under which the Amish and Mennonites continued to live, and in which it made sense to describe their experiences as simply variations of one another. I recognize that I have been influenced by John Hostetler's presentation, by the way he presented the story of the Amish, and also by my teacher at Goshen College there in Schlabach, who also presented the Old Order movement very sympathetically to me in classes and outside of classes, from a neo-Anabaptist perspective, and also in something of a liberal individualist mode. Amish adult baptism, the idea of Rumspringa, choosing the church, all these things. And yet I have to say that I have had in recent years a growing unease with that paradigm, or at least as uneasy in using that as the only paradigm. Not necessarily saying I'm abandoning it, but it has come first, a number of things. First, from recognizing that many Amish, well, to be honest, they don't care about my Mennoniteness or my Mennonite connection with them. It's not that I'm just their story in a different register. I'm simply not their story in any meaningful way. Due to the growth and geographic spread of a population that's doubling every 18 years, most Amish people in the U.S., not maybe isn't the case here in Ontario, but throughout the United States, are moving into more and more remote areas, rural areas, at the same time that, and are growing rapidly, at the same time that most assimilated Mennonite populations are either shrinking or moving to the cities and the suburbs. So the kind of ordinary interaction between Amish and Mennonite people that would have happened in the past is no longer there. And I remember, almost 20 years ago now, first being surprised when I introduced myself to an Amish bishop in southern Indiana and told him I was a Mennonite, and it became pretty clear that, I might as well have been a Presbyterian from San Francisco. It really didn't matter. And after that, meeting colleagues who have wonderful, academic colleagues who are Jewish, who have wonderful relationships with the Amish, and for whom being Mennonite, my being Mennonite, didn't seem to have made any difference at all. Likewise, as the defection rates, think about the other way, the retention rate of Amish youth to the church has gone up, and those who don't join the church in Amish circles aren't joining Mennonite churches. It's rare to find formerly Amish people in Mennonite churches today under the age of 70. I've had conversations with my colleague Karen Johnson Weiner about this, and I noticed, for example, that I would talk about the importance of the theology of believers' baptism and the importance of joining the church. And she said, "Why don't you talk about Amish joining the church? What about, isn't the choice really more to leave?" And on the one hand, it's both, but it's also there's a different place that you start when you frame it one way rather than the other. From a more, say, liberal individualist mode, I can even offer the Amish as a critique of modern society in this way. I say, well, the Amish approach to technology, just think what the Amish do. They take each piece of new technology and they analyze it with keen sociological insight. Even if they don't articulate it, what they're doing is they're asking, how will this change our community? And if it makes us stronger, we'll accept it, and if it dilutes us, we'll put it aside. And there is a concern for community with technological change, but for example, with the Schwarzentrooper Amish folks, the most conservative Amish group, who happen to be the group that's growing the fastest in the last 20 years, rather than doubling, they've grown by 170%. The Schwarzentrooper Amish, they do look at new technological change, and they'll say, well, if we adopt X, then we'll be out of fellowship with group Y and Z, and then who will our children marry? So we can't do this. So it is about community, but it's not quite what I wanted them to say about community. As a Mennonite, I recognized that I was also concerned about certain issues, particularly church-state issues, peace and non-resistance, photo IDs since 9/11 in light of the USA Patriot Act and crossing the US-Canada border, but often the issues that they're most concerned about when you mention church-state relations are not having smoke detectors, or not wanting to connect with to a public sewer system, or things like that. They're reaching out instead to more libertarian legal defense groups in the United States. And as one MCC staff person told me recently, today, if MCC advocates on behalf of the Amish, which they do, it's less a case of representing a constituency and more a parallel to our work on behalf of, say, a politically marginalized non-Anabaptist group in South Asia. And yet, I still find something very rewarding, and more than rewarding, some deep connection with my own evolving spirituality and that of the Amish. In the months after the Nickel Mine school shooting in 2006, interviewing some Amish people around that story and that experience, and being told by them that it's this practice, this is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it's not this way everywhere, but there, this practice of praying the Lord's Prayer at least 8 times a day. You wake in the morning before and after each of 3 meals and before you go to bed, and often 10, 11, 12 times a day. But this is what, that's the reason we do what we do. I'm hearing people articulate that. I'm going home and thinking, and also being told, one of the ways you can tell that a child is ready to start school is if they know the Lord's Prayer in English and German. That's sort of the good test that you're ready for grade 1. Going home and thinking, I wonder if my daughters know the Lord's Prayer. I don't think they do. And as a family deciding you're going to work on that as a family prayer, not before and after a meal, but at least before a meal, at least for a while. When considering a subject fraught with stereotypes and miscommunication, I hesitate to introduce any new generalizations. And yet it seems to me, maybe I'll get a little preachy here, that often Mennonites, assimilated Mennonites today, use the Amish to enhance ourselves as we employ them in a game of, let's compare my highest ideals with your worst examples. Such games may even be cloaked in the language of pastoral concern for the Amish, but somewhere along the way, the Mennonite desire to put the Amish in their place so as to assure ourselves that our place is present. What drives this Mennonite need? Are we embarrassed with an image of a past we were certain had no future, like Gertrude Huntington's Yale professors? Are we somehow jealous of the attention they attract without trying, while we spend a small fortune on church publicity and still fail to garner widespread name recognition, let alone busloads of people? My guess is that Mennonites, especially those living near Amish neighbors, tend to think that wider society has placed the Amish on a pedestal for universal reverence, and thus we are providing some sort of public service by taking the Amish down to a more realistic notch. If so, we may want to remember that the Amish in some quarters are still resented and even feared as a threat to society's well-being. And I've had conversations with local government officials in the U.S. Midwest about this. In some cases, outside businesses have been loath to move to a new place where census figures reveal that a high percentage of the potential workforce lacks high school credentials. Indeed, lucrative industry involved in certain export markets must adhere to international trade protocols mandating the hiring of none but high school graduates. And in this globalized economic world, a local workforce with a heavy Amish contingent is as much an economic development liability as it is a potential tourism asset. They're refusing to play by the rules that link a certain type of formal learning with higher wages. The Amish have become, in the minds of some local government officials in the U.S., an impediment to a brighter economic future. So in such a context of adulation and condemnation, there's probably no way to be anything like an objective observer. So when I, as an outsider, seek to interpret Amish life to other outsiders, I strive, in the interest of fairness and Christian generosity, to highlight the values of Amish society that I feel are so routinely dismissed by the modern world, and yet that interpretation says more about my understanding of fairness and what the world needs to hear than perhaps it does about the Amish themselves, and I have to recognize that. 15 years ago, a thoughtful reviewer of my book, A History of the Amish, suggested that the text actually was a critique of modern Mennonites, as well as a narrative of the Amish past. And I think he was probably right, although it surprised me when I first read that review. The saving remnant, to invoke David Weaver's Zerker, the saving remnant may lurk close to the surface of my mind as from time to time I survey today's Anabaptist panorama. I must confess that the values of community, the place of the past in the midst of change, and the skepticism towards the modern cult of progress are virtues that I do associate with the Amish. So when I consider the ways I have used the Amish, I hope that it has most often been as a corrective effort to keep me from making my own experiences into a universal yardstick. And scholars have big words for this. These mental traps, solipsism or centralizing the self or things like that. But it comes down to a belief that my world, my abilities and limitations, my fears, wants, needs, and resources are typical of everyone, and so I can safely make all sorts of assumptions about other people. This temptation is especially real for white middle-class men, since so much of society is structured in ways that are familiar to me. For me, then, the Amish have been, among other things, a nearby reminder that there are those who inhabit my world, who live with many of the same daily realities that I do, but who have responded to them in ways quite different than I have, and who live quite happily and productively with the alternative they have chosen. My assumptions about technology and entertainment and higher education and faith have been tempered to some degree by my association with the Amish. There is a different story out there, is what I remind myself. The Amish are not the only people who could have provided me with these insights. Other relationships may provide the same perspective, but in this case, the Amish have served me well. May we all find such communities where we can serve and be served, where we can know ourselves as we know others, and where we employ our stories for our mutual benefit. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Now I'm going to give Roy Malone the opportunity for the first response. Roy is a professor of history, chair of Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. He'll be more fully introduced tomorrow evening before his lecture, but Roy, again, welcome here, and please.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Steve, for that wonderful tour through Amish culture and so on. The task that I have here reminds me of something that Steve and I did during the many years in which we were putting together Seeking Places, a peace book, and I would write a chapter and email it to Steve, and he would critique it, and vice versa. So this is, I'm used to looking at Steve and saying, that's pretty good, Steve. However, and so on. But no, three windows of perspective on the Amish, I think very well crafted, and reminding me, I think, in fact, of one of the moments when I did get grumpy with Steve during our writing, and was basically we got along really well writing that book. But when Steve suggested to me at one point, it was just a table that the U.S. had about 3 times as many Mennonites as Canada, I got a little defensive. I said, I know you have more Mennonites than we have in Canada, but not that many more. And so I emailed Steve and said, where do you get these figures from? This really doesn't hold up in census records. He says, well, we count the Amish as Mennonites in the U.S. I said, well, what? So it was like, well, in that case, I want to count the Hutterites as Mennonites, and we're going to bump up our figure as well, and so on. But the point is that, we, just as those sociologists who had predicted the demise of the Amish, the last Amish person would pass away in 1954 or whatever, they don't go away, do they? They are there. My wife and I spent last fall in England, and Cambridge University professors have never heard of Mennonites. And so I would scratch my head and I try to, they all look like Quakers. And so finally I found a foolproof way of saying who the Mennonites are. The Mennonites are the people from whom the Amish broke away in 1693. Ah, that's you guys, right? They all heard of the piddly 285,000 Amish, but nobody heard of us, 500,000 Mennonites, and so on. So yeah, they are there, and we all grapple with them in some way, right? As window number one there, the U.S. popular imagination, helped along by Hollywood and so on, makes the Amish the lost innocence of the U.S. as they all pine for some Jeffersonian simplicity and invent the Amish as having been what they all once were and may yet want to be. And of course, we learn from Steve's third window that we ourselves as Mennonites look at the Amish, and in fact, it does raise one of the, if that was one of our grumpiest moments, one of the, when you write a book, and you have to release it to the public, and Steve mentioned this in Troy's class this afternoon, every sub-society of Mennonites finds at fault with us that we did not mention them or their kind or so on. I have been severely chastised for that in seeking places of peace. We did not mention the Mennonite Brethren Herald once. I've been severely chastised for, not mentioning Saskatchewan more than Manitoba. We were severely chastised for talking about Hispanic North Americans in a way that we would actually give them sort of equal footing in this book. And in a sense, we were just, after all, two middle-aged white guys. He's a little less middle-aged than I am, doing a pretty good job, but we had not really been missional. And somehow we defaulted to the old orders, and we sort of felt comfortable writing about the old orders, and that was a criticism. And so, yeah, the Amish are there. We will have to deal with them. And so the U.S. popular imagination has adopted them. We as Mennonites, in a sense, have adopted them too. Not only the American Mennonites who embellish their fading numbers, but we, looking at them as custodians of Anabaptism, at least in the practical praxis sense, is something we certainly do. And then the window number two is actually really interesting, I think, because we learn here that the Amish themselves define themselves vis-a-vis other people. And in this instance, Steve's window to the Low German Mennonites in Mexico, and that the Amish find a sense of reassurance that they have something to offer the wider culture. We have agreed, I think we would each ask each other a question, and I think my question to Steve would be, so what do the Amish think about us? And do they, looking at us, somehow reassure themselves that they are on the right track, or is it only to the Low German Mennonites in Mexico? The question comes out of a project that I am sort of completing. It's called Horse and Buggy Genius, and it looks at Old Order Mennonites in Southern Ontario and the Low German Horse and Buggy Mennonites in the Americas. There's a great quote from an Orthodox Old Order near that Lake Erie, or where they're settled. And he says, "Yeah, we don't debate Bible stuff like theology, or we get into, because what's going to happen, the slippery slope there is, before you know it, we're going to start debating things like biblical inerrancy, and then we're going to become just like Conrad college people." I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but I gathered that they look at us and somehow define themselves in relationship to our own failings. And I'm just wondering whether you've gotten a sense of that as well, Steve.
And by looking at us, you mean Mennonites? Yeah. Like that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. At least in northern Indiana, I have noticed a real difference between Old Order Mennonites and Amish on this score. I think Old Order Mennonites, by bearing the Mennonite name, I'll say we, Goshen College, for example, have they are the Horse and Buggy Old Order Mennonites in Elkhart County, Indiana, are much more, I was going to say uptight, and that's probably not a good, I should find a better word than that, but much more concerned about differentiating themselves and using us as a negative foil. The Amish, not only there in Northern Indiana, but in general, I have rarely found them to be all that concerned about Mennonites. And in fact, the ones who are tend to be, so if there's a spectrum, there would be at the one end New Order Amish that might be kind of shading into that Beachy Amish. So it's at that end of the spectrum where I'll have someone say, you know, well, there's this medical presentation in Shipshewana. What do you think of that? And, you know, so obviously a loaded question, and so I can tell them in a pretty neutral way what I think of it. I mean, I think it's good, but I don't, you know, so I just say, yeah, that's good. And then they'll say, well, you know, it is good until you get to the last room, and then they show a woman behind a pulpit. And of course, for the Amish, I mean, just having a pulpit is a problem. So what's, you know, I mean, the difference there. Yeah. Anyway, I have not found the Amish to be all that concerned with or concerned about. Let's call them more assimilated Mennonites, but older Mennonites, yes, that's been something I've definitely noticed.
So I'm going to invite questions now. Please ask the question. I think we have a mic potentially available, and so that we can hear the question. But we have about 10-15 minutes. Be glad to hear from you and then have Steve respond.
Could you elaborate on the language that the teachers from North America use when they go to Mexico?
Yeah.
Talk to the teachers and to the students.
Right, that's a good question. They, Amish schools are conducted in English. Most Amish schools say that they also have a German class where they teach German. That often doesn't happen because the teachers don't feel comfortable. The Amish teachers really don't feel comfortable teaching German, you know, what we might call High German. So the teachers who've gone to Mexico tend to be those who had studied or felt comfortable teaching German. I mean, German professors here would, you know, I'm sure critique their use of German, but who feel so the language that they try to use is High German. Now, Ray and I were talking about this, about the old colony Mennonite teachers also have a pretty tenuous grasp of German, so there might be some interesting conversations there between two people who are essentially using a second language that they don't know all that well. And some of the Amish teachers will write about events, not just in school, but outside of school in the community, where there's translation going on between, and they use dictionaries, and there's translation that in one event might include Low German, Pennsylvania Dutch, German, English, and Spanish, depending who all's there to make the connections that are necessary to have a fairly simple conversation. The Amish teachers have also reflected on language. This is one of the few times I've seen self-conscious reflection on language and the importance of language. So I don't know if you can say that the Amish are experiencing a linguistic turn in the early 21st century, but they recognize the value of it. Look, for example, they will say the importance that Old Colony peoples place on German as a religious language has made us wonder whether we should think more carefully about what language we use when we talk about God. You know, I mean, there's long been a kind of relativism about language. You know, Amish people would have said in the 19th century, there's nothing wrong with English, but you know, when Dutch people use English, that's pride. You know, so that's the problem with English. It's not that it's somehow one language is better suited to convey divine truth, but the fact that they hear that from Old Colony Mennonites, or think they hear that, they've talked about that maybe language means something more than they ever realized. inflection or articulation on those kinds of things, but when you ask Amish people ask those sorts of questions, they respond with a kind of flip side of their humility theology that has denied assurance of salvation, which is to say, we deny knowing that anyone else is really wrong. We don't, God is the judge, and so the importance is maintaining fidelity to your tradition. There will be critiques. I've heard critiques of churches that spend too much money on their church buildings, things like that, but we just don't know. We don't know. God is the judge for us and for others, and so we're not going to judge others. I have heard some Amish people express surprise that, and kind of bewilderment that, for example, Catholic lawyers and Catholic legal associations have been, in some cases, most active in defending Amish religious liberty rights. And I'll say, well, why do you think that is? They used to persecute us. Now they're acting as our lawyers. So they recognize that there's a difference there they recognize that they don't quite understand the terms that they thought existed here between groups aren't quite what they thought, but they're not going to condemn other groups.
Thank you, Steve. I'm intrigued by the reports of the teachers coming back, and they're reminiscent of the MCC teachers that went out, the Teach the Draw program in the 60s and 70s in Africa and other places. Robert Crider, father of that program, said it changed the church in North America. Do you have any idea where this exchange might go in the Amish community?
Yeah.
Are there any concerns expressed by Amish leaders about the new findings and understandings that these women teachers are coming back with?
That's a great question, and I've wondered about those kinds of parallels myself. The Amish teachers even have, now they're not personalized with their names, that would be, I think, too individualistic, but they have this program, the teachers in this program have little prayer cards that they actually distribute. And they say, put this in your kitchen and remember us while we're away. So, anyway, just say there's a lot of interesting parallels to things that they do. We can think of earlier generations of Mennonite mission and service workers. I have not heard fears or anxieties articulated about this. I also have to say I have not, I spent my time in the last months reading the print material and talking to some of the teachers who have returned. So I have not done anything close to systematic interviews in the sense of systematically trying to talk to people who represent different Amish voices in this. It certainly is, although there have been more than 100 people who have gone or who are still there, it is one slice in the Amish, of the Amish spectrum. And so certainly the most conservative groups don't participate. This is at the more progressive end of things, although not New Order Amish. I mean more. So not in the more progressive, meaning evangelical end of the Amish world, but I mean sort of in the more, I guess you'd say more technologically progressive, relatively speaking, segment of the Amish world. The segment of the Amish world of which an Amish leader here in Ontario said about some folks that around me, well, they want to be Amish, but they don't know how. But those Amish folks are some of the ones who are most supportive of this program, and so that's probably also a constituency that is less instinctively concerned about these kind of changes. The groups that would be more instinctively concerned aren't participating, and there's still, I should say there still are ways in which the program is constrained. So, for example, people who are staying there long term, like for several years, still go north twice a year to participate in communion. They are not establishing Amish churches there, and it's important that the Amish people who are there come home and participate in the religious rituals of renewing the ordinum and committing to the church. So, for example, only traveling there by train and bus, and not flying to El Paso and then driving. So it's not like they're really casting off all sorts of tradition.
It's a long way to bring a mic for a trivial question. Steve, I wonder, a few years ago I was in Sarasota and there were some horse and buggy folk from northern Indiana there. I think they were Amish. But could you comment, you talked about tourism, this seemed like a kind of tourism as well, but of a strange variety. Is that what's happening there? It's an odd phenomenon. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, there is this phenomenon of Amish snowbirds in Sarasota, Florida. Again, it appeals to a certain segment of the Amish spectrum. There are large swaths of Amish society that would never go to Sarasota. But there are some people there's some segments for whom it is an annual affair. Since the 1920s, there has been a small, very small, but small permanent Amish community in Sarasota County, Florida. Moved there in the 1920s to engage in celery farming. So there was year-round celery farming in that area. Then decades later, some other people started going there older people going there in the winter. And that has grown, and there are now Amish rental houses, rental units and things that are there where people stay, and few people live there year-round, but it's mostly seasonal, and it has an interesting parallel to the Amish teachers in that people can't go until after fall communion, and then they have to go home before spring communion. So that is kind of the limit of, that's sort of the maximum that winter can last. There are 2 or 3, depending on the year, 2 or 3 different church services that operate, and people will, there's a kind of sort of sorting out there on Sunday morning of who goes where. A non-Amish person from Pennsylvania, Rich Stevik, who spent some time there, has characterized Sarasota. He said, well, it's not exactly lax, but it is relaxed Amish life there. So there are some Amish businesses there, and there have been some Amish young people who haven't joined the church who sometimes go there and summer and will maybe use a cottage or an apartment that their grandparents have. And it's actually outside of Sarasota. It's in Sarasota County, but outside of the city limits of Sarasota. And the local name of the community is Pinecraft.
Thanks, Steve. Do the Amish read what you write about them? Or are they curious about what you write about them as a possible counterbalance to the breaking Amish portrayals, for instance?
Yeah, good question. Some of them are. I know some people read the things that I've written, and some of them read it before it's published because I send it to them. And so there are a circle of Amish readers that I have, and they are very helpful for certain things. There's a kind of, at least as I've experienced, a certain kind of Amish reading, which is a very literal reading. And so they'll make lots of notes on, marginal notes, and they might mark a sentence that says, well, you said that no Amish families have wall-to-wall carpet. Well, there is one family in Kansas. So I think you should change that sentence because it's not true. So sometimes the comments are and on that level that are helpful, but there are also other more. There are some people who do read it with kind of the same sort of big picture questions. I'll say big picture, but the same sort of questions that I have in mind, and have gotten good I've gotten valuable feedback on that, and I've had a few times where people have said that they've gotten into a discussion that was going to turn into an argument with one of their teenage children, and they said, well, we just had to pull off such and such a book and, show them that, no, this is what we're doing. And I sort of hesitate being the authority in that, in a family conflict like that. But I also know that there are plenty of Amish people who aren't interested and who are not interested and who don't read it. But there are some who do. Shared in class this afternoon, we had in 1999-2000, colleague Tom Myers and I spent a year systematically visiting all, at that time there were 18 Amish settlements in Indiana. And over time we also then followed reports of our visits in the Amish correspondence newspapers. So we were talking to people, and then we could read about what they were talking about, us talking with them about. So sort of another level of discussion of our research.
Question over there. And after that, we'll have time for one more question.
Thank you so much. We are going to have a conference here in June on music and the environment, and I've been working, Sound in the Land, and I've been working for the best part of a year to bring an Amishman up here, David Klein, whom you probably know. It's not going to work, but I've had the incredible pleasure of, unless he changes his mind, gets his passport worked out, but I've had the incredible pleasure of having a lot of phone calls with him, and I have two questions. He was talking, he's also a naturalist, and he talked about meeting in their barn, and it was very to him that this rare bird, the barn owl, came to that barn, and while they were singing, the barn owl was very disturbed, and they were afraid the thing was going to move away. But as soon as the preacher started preaching, the barn owl went to sleep again. So, my first question is, do they for sure, what we hope they still do, are they still singing out of the Ausbund in German? And two, is the preaching in High German? And that's what puts the bird to sleep?
The first question, yes, in almost all cases, the singing is from the Ausbund. The handful of exceptions to that are communities that already in the late 19th century had adopted variations on the Ausbund. But otherwise, yeah, they're all singing from the Ausbund. Preaching, in my experience and in interviewing Amish people, preaching is generally in Pennsylvania Dutch. There's really not much preaching in High German, although the Bible is being read in High German, and there may be some, what shall I say, doctrinal words in High German that are sprinkled in, that are used because there is no Pennsylvania Dutch equivalent for those. But the sermons are basically in Pennsylvania Dutch today, and probably have been for several generations. Yeah. Again, the exception there would be the handful of Amish settlements that use more of a Swiss dialect because of their particular immigration stream. But in any case, that's not High German either.
Yes, there's one question over here, and that'll be the last question.
Here in Ontario, we have the Aylmer Amish community, who put a lot of effort into their publications and articulate a certain vision of Amish life and apologists for it. Would you comment on how that particular community and effort is viewed across the Amish community, and are they truly sort of the leaders of understanding, self-understanding of the Amish?
Yeah. The Aylmer Amish community, which I think today there are 3 church districts there, but are associated with Pathway Publishers that has an active publication program of Amish school books and monthly magazines, 3 magazines, Family Life, Young Companion, and Blackboard Bulletin, as well as children's books and adult fiction and other is quite influential. It is not universally appreciated or approved, although it's really hard to say that anything is universally appreciated and approved among the Amish today. But I would say Pathways is broadly respected and would be influential in, I just say off the cuff, in a sizable majority of Amish communities, maybe 2/3, something like that. There would be some of the more conservative communities that don't take any of the Pathway publications because because they're new. They started in the 1960s, so it's not something that, from one perspective, has a really long history. There are some communities. There's also, particularly on the issue of textbooks specifically, there's a bit of a rivalry. Some would say it's more rooted in an economic rivalry, but in any case, there are other Amish curricula publishers, and so there are some Amish communities that don't use the Pathway readers, for example, and use other books that were done by an Amish publisher in Pennsylvania and an Amish publisher in Indiana. Amish schools are not centrally controlled in any way, so there's a lot of variation. And then there are some Amish communities who think that Pathway is too presents a kind of religious articulation that might actually be dangerous. So, for example, Family Life, the monthly magazine Family Life, for a while had a column, and it wasn't written by someone from Elmer, it was actually written by someone from Pennsylvania, but this column was called "The Scriptures Have the Answers." And they got a certain amount of resistance to that because readers were citing the Scriptures Have the Answers column. This became like an outside source that you could cite in a debate about something. And the folks in Elmer themselves, I think, to their Amish credit, quickly recognized that as not being part of the Amish tradition or Amish polity in terms of church authority. And so they in that case, actually stopped that column. But nonetheless, there still are, there'll be very pointed articles about tobacco, for example, or things that are not always appreciated in all Amish settings. But yeah, the Amish community is quite influential.
Thank you, Steve. We're very grateful to you, Steve. Thank you very much. Look forward to having you with us again tomorrow evening. We'll meet here in the same place. We'll hear Roy, and then you'll hear Steve respond. We'll have a chance for questions and engagement, and we'll have a reception afterwards down in the atrium area, and there will be books. So we'll look forward to a good evening. Now, for those of you who are interested, many of you may have come in through the entrance from the parking lot down through the lower door and up to the building, but some of you may be aware that you could actually go out to the atrium and walk out the front entrance and get to the parking lot. Now you have to go out around the construction fence. It may not be shorter, but you can say, that's what you did. You walk through the new entrance. And certainly you can do it tomorrow evening. But that area is functional. There is a large display of construction machinery in the atrium still, with a nice sign on it saying that it's not a modern art exhibit. It's actually tools that are at work here. But you'd be welcome to explore that area. And tomorrow night we'll have a reception there. Wonderful to have you with us. Thanks again, Steve.